Hello and welcome to the Kim Iversen Show. The missing OceanGate Titan submarine saga has reached a conclusion. The submarine imploded. Apparently, debris was discovered by a remotely operated vehicle on the ocean floor, roughly 500 meters off the bow of the Titanic at about 8:55 a.m. this morning. Coast Guard Rear Admiral John Mauger said after consultation with experts from within the Unified Command, the debris is consistent with the catastrophic loss of the pressure chamber. So that means it collapsed and then exploded. I'm going to show you, actually, there's a video. This is kind of like a mock-up video of what that would look like. So you could see that here. Is it just collapses and then explodes. Here's the video of that. So instant death is really what that looks like. It would happen really, really quickly. So that video actually kind of slows it down. I mean, this collapse and explosion is much, much slower than the actual event would have been, according to experts that know about these types of things. So now, how far down did they get? The Titanic is about 12,000 feet below the surface, like 2.5 miles below the surface. And a new update from sources say that the Navy actually detected a blast on Sunday that would have put the submarine about 1,600 feet from the Titanic. So they got really close to it. But, you know, the further down you get, the pressure just gets crazy. It's like 6,000 pounds per square inch. I mean, it's just an immense amount of pressure. And I guess as they just kept going down and down and down, it did lose communication with the surface vessel at about 1 hour and 45 minutes. And I believe it takes about 2 hours to get down to the Titanic. And then you kind of explore for a bit. And then you have to take your ascent back up to the ocean, which I think takes longer than the actual descent. So the entire trip, this kind of sightseeing trip, is supposed to take about 8 hours in total. But they lost communication with the vessel at 1 hour and 45 minutes. And then it looks like the thing exploded or imploded the minute that when it got to about 1,600 feet from the Titanic. So the good news about that, I mean, it's really tragic. 5 people were on board, and they all obviously died instantaneously, but that means that no one ran out of air. And that was the big question that everyone was having. It was this kind of countdown because there were 4 days of air. They were reported missing when they were supposed to, when they missed their scheduled ascent time. They were supposed to be back up to the surface. And so the research vehicle called in for the Coast Guard and everybody to help out because they had lost communication with it. They couldn't find it. They were hopeful that maybe their communication system went down, and so maybe it would still surface, but it didn't. And so they called in everybody for the big search and rescue effort. And and then the countdown, and everybody was like, "Oh my gosh, these guys are going to run out of air." And there's 5 people on this submarine, and they only get 4 days worth of air, so they would have run out of air at about 6:30 in the morning Eastern time today, and so that was really tragic. But the submarine had enough air for 4 days for 5 people, or 20 days for 1 person, which puts you in a very precarious position if the submarine really had just gotten lost and they were sitting there and waiting to be rescued. A lot of questions about life and death start to circulate around. Like, is it we all live or we all die, live together, die together? Or do you start saying, okay, strategically, there's 20 days of air if one of us is alive, so which one of us do we save? Or do we start picking people off in order to extend the amount of time that we've got air on this submarine? And you'd have to make that decision right away. You can't wait 4 days and say, okay, I guess, all of it, 4 of us are going to kill ourselves so that one could live. And then maybe you could live a few more days. I mean, you'd have to do it fairly early on while there's still a lot of air left in the submarine. So it puts a lot of really terrible questions into a person's mind if that's the scenario that you're in. I mean, I couldn't even imagine. In my mind, I guess, of course, I would want to say, let the young kid live, the 19-year-old or the 18-year-old who was on board. But, what a terrible situation to be in. I mean, think about that for a minute. You're sitting there And you've got the people on board. We did have the Stockton Rush. He was the CEO of Ocean Gate. You have George Hamish Livingston Harding. He was a British businessman, pilot, explorer, space tourist. He was based out of the United Arab Emirates. You got Paul-Henri Nargeolet. He was a French deep-sea explorer. He was known as Mr. Titanic. He was a Titanic expert. You had Shahzada Dawood. He was a Pakistani and British businessman and investor, and apparently he was just an exploration enthusiast, and he brought along his 19-year-old son, Suleiman, and it cost $250,000 per person to go on this. So a lot of people are like, oh, who cares about the billionaires? This whole saga sort of brought out online, at least, a lot of the hate for billionaires. You could see that for sure. And we're going to get into kind of the questions about this whole saga, because there are a lot of political questions and there's kind of philosophical questions around it. But you know, when you're looking at these guys, you know, if you're going to have to do a life and death sort of decision making while you're stuck on a submarine, I mean, thank God they didn't have to do this. Their deaths were instantaneous and none of them even knew it happened. But, you know, who do you start? What a terrible situation to be in. Now, like I said, a lot of people are criticizing this entire ordeal because first of all, a bunch of rich people are on board. You have to pay $250,000 to get on this thing. And the submarine itself seemed really poorly designed. It couldn't be opened from the inside. For example, all of the passengers had to get into it, and then they were bolted inside from the research vessel. So if something were to happen and let's say it gets lost and they rise to the surface and they're not where the research vessel is, they can't even open it up to get fresh air if they rise to the surface. So that seems to be just right there a big safety hazard. There was no navigation system on board. So again, you could get lost. You have to, easy to get lost considering the only communication with the surface research vessel is to text that research vessel, which we all know that doesn't even work that well on the surface a lot of the times. So how would that work when you're miles underneath the ocean with pounds of water above you? It just seems like it was a really unsafe design. And there was even actually a whistleblower in the company that back in 2018 was raising concerns about the safety of this passenger tourist submarine, and ended up being fired and went to court and detailed in the court case a lot of the safety issues with this submarine. Here's just a little video of the CEO actually showing some of the stuff, because part of it was like run by a Logitech controller. So you could see kind of how this submarine, it didn't seem very sophisticated. Here this is.
We only have one button, that's it. It should be like an elevator. You know, it shouldn't take a lot of skill. I got these from Camper World. We run the whole thing with this game controller.
Come on!
Yeah, so, you know, it just, and then he says, and then the CEO admits to breaking a lot of rules in order to innovate. Here's a video of that.
I'd like to be remembered as an innovator. I think it was General MacArthur said, you're remembered for the rules you break. And, you know, I've broken some rules to make this. I think I've broken them with logic and good engineering behind me. The carbon fiber and titanium, there's a rule you don't do that. Well, I did. It's picking the rules that you break that are the ones that will add value to others and add value to society. And that really, to me, is about innovation. It's not invention. You know, innovation is when you take an invention and you make it, you know, accepted broadly. And maybe think of ocean exploration the way everybody thinks of space exploration.
Okay, so, you know, he's saying right there, you don't cut corners in certain things. He actually said in another interview that, yeah, there's a lot of things that we did that, you know, kind of seem like we cut corners, but there's certain things that you don't cut corners on. And one of those is the actual pressure chamber. But he says in that video, you know, we use titanium and carbon fiber, and they tell us not to do that, but we did it anyway. And I guess, you know, as they kind of look into this, as they collect the debris, they're going to find out exactly what caused this submarine to implode. And maybe it was the fact that they used carbon fiber and titanium rather than just using straight up titanium the entire time. So there's going to be a lot of questions on this. Now, one of the, you know, the philosophical question, well, first of all, there's a political question to this, and that is, you've got these companies that are willing to do this innovation. And yes, innovation and exploration is really good for society. This is how we got airplanes, how we got automobiles, how we got even boats and submarines and just exploration of new lands. We're going out to space. You've got companies building rockets. I mean, these types of things are good for society to have this sort of innovation and exploration. We should champion innovation. We should champion exploration. But the question then becomes, when you take this risk, and he says in there, I think it's risky. He understands that this type of exploration, I think all of the men on board this submarine understood the risk of death in this. They understood that they could end up not coming back. I think you understand that if you're an astronaut and you get yourself into a space rocket, you understand there's a chance you will not come home alive. I think all of these explorers understand that. In fact, in order to ride this submarine, you have to sign a document that says, I understand there's a risk of death. So they all understood that risk, but they're saying they believe the risk to be worth it, that the exploration, the innovation, that is worth the risk of death, is to be one of the first that maybe could create something. And this is what the CEO talked about. He said, I want to deregulate because there's a appetite for ocean exploration, and yet it's so heavily regulated that there's no way that average people could get on board a submarine and go, and now we count on airplanes, for example. And there was a period of time when they had to really, truly go and look at, they had to, the safety of airplanes. I mean, they didn't just work, from the beginning. They have to actually work on them and innovate and continue and advance. And so the CEO of OceanGate had that same sort of idea that there's an appetite for ocean exploration, and we should deregulate in order to allow that to happen. So there was some deregulation that he pushed for, and now you end up with this sort of fiasco, and people are pointing to that and saying, see, you shouldn't deregulate because then you end up with this loss of life. But again, these people understood that risk when they got onto that submarine, and the CEO understood that risk when he was pushing for deregulation and trying new things in the creation of this submarine. So I think there's a big question there to be had, a debate to be had in society on, how valuable is the risk of exploration, and do we allow deregulation in order to get that? And then the big question I think a lot of taxpayers have is then who should pay for the search and rescue? If you know the risks, you go into it knowing that this is a risky thing. You're asking for deregulation. You're trying to innovate. You understand there's a risk of death. You understand that there's a risk of getting lost or all of these various things that you can't even imagine happening. Who then should be responsible when you're making these risky decisions for your search and rescue efforts? We know that the Coast Guard was involved, the Navy was involved, the Air National Guard was involved, the Canadian military was involved. So there was a big search and rescue effort for these 5 very wealthy people in this very risky activity that they knowingly did. So who should have to pay for it? That's the big question. Now, some people would say they, as a company, should have if you're going to build a company knowing it's risky, and you're going to be doing risky things, then what you should do is you should have a division of your company that is paid for your own search and rescue, that you don't bring in the military and the taxpayer dollars for it. On the other hand, the company says, well, we pay a lot of money in taxes. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It depends on the company, right? They would say, well, we pay a lot of money for taxes, and those tax dollars go for these sorts of search and rescue. It's like a person calls 911. They don't, the cops don't say, well, how many did you pay your taxes? Before I show up, did you pay for me? Or, why am I coming to your rescue? So there's a good, I think, political discussion to have about these risky companies that are really, do we value them enough to pay for their search and rescue efforts? Or should we say to them, no, you have to pay for your own search and rescue efforts because you're doing something risky knowingly? Really interested in hearing your thoughts on that. You can email me, kim@kimiversen.com. Would love to hear from you. What do you think politically is the right way to handle this type of risky behavior and risky innovation? So that is, that's a good question. All right. Well, if you struggle to get a good night's sleep, if you're dealing with too much stress and could use a little calm in your life, if you suffer with pain and discomfort, especially after physical exercise, you should try CBD products from the source I prefer, cbdistillery.com. They extract healing plant compounds and vital nutrients for your whole body. There are no artificial colors, flavors, preservatives, or sweeteners, just 100% clean ingredients. 90% of customers reported they sleep better with CBD. 81% said CBD helps them with stress. 80% said CBD helps with aches and pains after physical activity. So head to cbdistillery.com and you're going to get 20% off your order when you enter my name, Kim, at checkout. No prescription required. That is cbdistillery.com, promo code Kim for 20% off.